Sometimes the deepest bonds form between two broken souls who understand each other's pain. When mountain man Silas Grady found a dying dog in the wilderness, both had given up on the world, and the world had given up on them. The dog couldn't bark, couldn't trust, could barely walk. Silas hadn't spoken to another human in 3 years. But when they rode into Dry Creek together, something began to heal between them. The townspeople whispered about the strange pair, a ghost of a man and his silent companion. Then children started disappearing. The sheriff was stumped. Panic spread through every household. But that voiceless dog began acting different, pulling Silas toward the canyon where no one dared venture. What could a broken man and a silent dog accomplish against the darkness threatening an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Creek's weathered main street as Silas Grady guided his mare through town, the silent dog padding beside them on legs that still favored his left side. 3 months had passed since that July evening when he'd first ridden in with the broken animal, and the seasons were turning toward autumn's crisp promise. The dog wore a worn leather collar, now one Silas had fashioned from an old saddle strap, but still no name had settled between them. Names seemed unnecessary when understanding ran deeper than words. Silas dismounted outside Murphy's general store, his weathered hands gentle as he helped the dog down from where he'd been riding across the saddle. The animal's ribs no longer showed through his coat, and his amber eyes held a brightness that hadn't been there in those first desperate days. Yet still, no sound ever escaped his throat. Doc Henley claimed the dog's vocal cords had been damaged beyond repair, though by what, no one could say. "Morning, Silas." Margaret Murphy emerged from her store, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 62, she'd lived through enough seasons in Dry Creek to measure a man's worth by his actions rather than his reputation. "How's our quiet friend doing?" The dog's tail moved in a subtle wag, and Silas found himself almost smiling. "Better every day, Mrs. Murphy. We're needing some supplies, coffee, beans, maybe some of that jerky if you've got it." "Course I do." She studied Silas with eyes that had watched him transform over these past months. The haunted look that had shadowed his features when he'd first returned was lifting, replaced by something steadier. "You know, Doc was asking after you both yesterday. Said he'd like to check on the dog's healing." Silas nodded, his fingers unconsciously moving to scratch behind the dog's ears. It was a gesture that had become second nature, this gentle contact that seemed to calm them both. "We'll stop by before we head back up." The transformation in both man and animal hadn't gone unnoticed by the townspeople. Silas Grady had been a name spoken in hushed tones for 5 years. The tracker who'd come back from a manhunt with blood on his hands and grief carved into his soul. A child caught in crossfire. A moment's hesitation that became a lifetime of regret. He'd vanished into the mountains the next morning, and most folks figured the wilderness had claimed him. But here he stood, altered by solitude and by the unlikely companionship that had found him. The dog had saved him as much as he'd saved the dog, a truth that settled in his chest like a warm ember every time he looked into those knowing amber eyes. "Silas Grady." Sheriff Tom Hutchins approached with measured steps, his badge catching the morning light. Tom was past 50, his hair silver at the temples, and he carried the weight of keeping peace in a town that straddled the line between civilization and the wild country beyond. "Heard you might be staying in town a few days, just for supplies." Silas's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned to guard his words. "We'll be heading back up come tomorrow. Before you do, I'd like a word. Maybe over at Rose's for coffee." The sheriff's tone held respect rather than suspicion. "Nothing urgent, just there's been some peculiar happenings lately. Thought you might have noticed anything up in your territory." The dog's ears pricked forward at something in the sheriff's voice, and Silas felt the animal's sudden alertness through the rope that connected them. "What kind of happenings?" "Break-ins, Mostly, tools gone missing from the Hendersons' place. Food taken from the Kraus ranch. Strange tracks near the Miller cabin. Tom's weathered face creased with concern. Nothing violent, but it's got folks unsettled. Pattern to it, like someone's testing boundaries. Silas considered this, his tracker's instincts stirring despite himself. The mountains held their own rhythms, and disturbances in those patterns had meaning. How long's this been going on? Started maybe 6 weeks ago. Getting bolder, seems like. The sheriff glanced down at the silent dog, who was now focused entirely on their conversation. Funny thing is, most of these places have dogs that should have raised hell. But the owners found their animals calm as Sunday morning, like they'd been gentled somehow. An odd chill traced down Silas's spine. The dog beside him had gone very still, not with fear, but with the kind of intense attention Silas had learned to recognize. It was the same focus the animal showed when tracking scent trails or sensing changes in weather patterns. "I'll keep an eye out," Silas said finally. "If we see anything unusual up there, I'll let you know. Appreciate that." And Silas, Tom paused, choosing his words carefully. "I know you've been keeping to yourself these past years, and that's your right. But you were the best tracker this county ever saw. If things get worse, if this escalates beyond missing tools, well, this town might need that skill again." The weight of old responsibilities pressed against Silas's chest, familiar as an ache in winter bones. He'd thought himself done with such duties, had believed the wilderness would be sanctuary enough. But the dog's continued alertness and the sheriff's words stirred something he'd thought buried. "I understand," he said quietly. As they made their way to Doc Henley's office, Silas found himself studying the town with fresh eyes. Dry Creek had always been a close-knit community, the kind of place where people looked after their neighbors and strangers were noticed. The streets he remembered from his younger days looked much the same: weathered storefronts, hitching posts worn smooth by countless rains, the eternal dust that no amount of sweeping could banish. But there was tension beneath the familiar surface, visible in the way mothers kept their children closer, in the suspicious glances cast at shadows that might hide watching eyes. Fear was settling over Dry Creek like morning frost, subtle but persistent. Doc Henley's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building that also housed his living quarters. At 71, he remained the most educated man in 3 counties, with medical training from back east and a lifetime of frontier experience that made him equal parts physician and philosopher. "Well, look who's come calling." The doctor emerged from his examination room, medical bag in hand, and a genuine smile creasing his features. "And how's my most mysterious patient?" The dog's tail wagged, still silent, but his pleasure at seeing the kind doctor was evident. Silas had never seen the animal show such immediate trust to anyone else, and it spoke to something fundamental in Doc Henley's character. He's doing well, putting on weight, moving easier. Silas helped the dog onto the examination table, noting how the animal no longer flinched at being lifted. Still no voice, but he seems content enough. "Let me have a look." Doc Henley's hands moved with practiced gentleness, checking the dog's healing wounds, listening to his heartbeat, examining the throat that would never produce sound. Remarkable recovery, really. "When you first brought him in, I wasn't certain he'd make it through the night." "What do you think happened to him?" "To his voice, I mean." The doctor's expression grew thoughtful as he continued his examination. "Hard to say with certainty. Could have been injury, something caught around his throat, or a blow that damaged the vocal cords. Could have been illness, though that's less likely given his general health." He paused, scratching the dog's chin. "Or it could have been intentional." Intentional? Some men are cruel enough to silence a dog that barks too much. Seen it before, unfortunately. Doc Henley's voice carried a weight of sad experience. "Whatever happened, it was before you found him. The scarring's old, healed long before he came into your care." Silas felt anger stir in his chest, not the wild, destructive rage that had once consumed him, but a quieter, more focused emotion. The thought of someone deliberately harming this gentle creature struck him as a particular kind of evil. "He's lucky you found him," the doctor continued, "and from what I can see, you're both better for the companionship." It was true, though Silas rarely examined the change too closely. The dog's presence had given him purpose beyond mere survival, had drawn him back from the edge of isolation that might have claimed his sanity entirely. In caring for another living thing, he'd found a path back to caring about himself. As they prepared to leave, Doc Henley caught Silas's arm. "Tom mentioned he spoke with you about the recent troubles. If you do decide to help, be careful. There's something different about this situation, something that doesn't sit right with my old bones." Outside, the afternoon was settling toward evening, and Silas decided they'd spend the night at the boarding house rather than make the trek back to his mountain cabin in fading light. As they walked down Main Street, the dog suddenly stopped, his entire body going rigid with attention. Silas followed the animal's gaze toward the mouth of Canyon Road, where the street gave way to rougher ground that eventually led to the notorious Devil's Throat, a narrow gorge where the rock walls rose so high and steep that sunlight barely reached the bottom. It was dangerous country, the kind of place where a man could disappear without a trace. The dog's nose worked the air, and something in his posture spoke of recognition, not fear, but a kind of knowing that raised the hair on Silas's arms. Whatever scent the animal was reading on the wind, it meant something to him. "What is it, boy?" Silas asked quietly, though he expected no answer. The dog's amber eyes fixed on his face for a long moment, then returned to the canyon road. Together, they stood in the gathering dusk, two silent figures bound by understanding that ran deeper than words, and both sensing that their peaceful interlude in Dry Creek was about to end. The scream shattered the pre-dawn quiet like glass against stone. Silas jerked awake in his boarding house bed, instantly alert in the way that years of mountain living had trained into his bones. Beside the bed, the dog was already on his feet, hackles raised, amber eyes fixed on the window that faced Main Street. Whatever sound had torn through the morning silence, the animal had heard it too. Another cry, this one clearly a woman's voice, raw with terror and desperation. "Help! Someone help me! Emma's gone!" Silas was dressed and moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct. The dog padded silently beside him as they descended the boarding house stairs and stepped into the grey light of dawn. Down the street, he could see a cluster of figures gathering around the Miller house, their voices carrying on the still air. "When did you last see her?" Sheriff Hutchins's voice, calm but urgent. "Last night, when I tucked her in. She was right there in her bed." This from Sarah Miller, her words broken by sobs. "I checked on her before I went to sleep myself. She was there, Tom. She was there." By the time Silas reached the group, most of Dry Creek's early risers had assembled. Doc Henley stood beside the distraught mother, his medical bag in hand, though there was nothing his skills could mend here. Margaret Murphy had her arm around Sarah Miller's shoulders, offering what comfort she could. The missing child's father, Jake Miller, stood apart from the group, his face grey with shock and something approaching panic. "Tell me exactly what happened," Sheriff Hutchins was saying, his notebook already out. "I woke up to check on Emma. She's been having nightmares lately about monsters in the canyon." Sarah's voice cracked. "Her room was empty, the window was open, but it was closed when I put her to bed." "I know it was closed." Silas found himself studying the ground around the house without conscious decision. Old habits died hard, and his tracker's eye automatically catalogued details. No obvious disturbance in the dirt near the window, no clear footprints in the hard-packed earth. Too many people had already trampled the area for a clean reading. The dog pressed close to his leg, and Silas realized the animal was trembling not with fear, but with barely contained energy. Something about this situation was affecting him deeply. "How old is the girl?" Silas asked quietly. Jake Miller looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "7. Just turned 7 last month." His voice broke. "She's small for her age, trusts everyone. If someone came to her window, said the right things." "Don't." Sheriff Hutchins held up a firm hand. "Don't go down that road yet. Could be she wandered off on her own, got turned around in the dark." But even as the sheriff spoke, Silas could see the doubt in his eyes. 7-year-old children didn't typically climb out bedroom windows in the middle of the night, especially children who'd been having nightmares about monsters. "The window's 12 feet off the ground," Jake said hollowly. "Even if she wanted to leave, she couldn't have gotten down on her own. And there's no ladder, no way up from outside. Without—" He stopped, the implications hanging heavy in the morning air. Doc Henley cleared his throat. "Tom, if someone did take her, we're losing time standing here talking." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Jake, I need you to get word to the ranches, have them organize search parties. Sarah, I want you to think hard. Has Emma mentioned seeing any strangers lately? Anyone new in town? Anyone asking questions about children?" There was. Sarah's voice caught. "Last week, she said she saw a man watching her from across the street when she was playing in the yard. When I looked, there was no one there. I thought she was imagining things." A chill ran down Silas's spine. The dog beside him had gone very still, the way he did when picking up a scent trail that meant something important. Almost without thinking, Silas knelt beside the animal. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. The dog's nose worked the air, then he began moving toward the back of the Miller house with purposeful steps. Silas followed, noting how the animal's entire posture had changed from trembling alertness to focused determination. Behind the house, away from the churned-up ground where the searchers had gathered, the dog stopped beside a section of fence. Here, finally, Silas could read the story written in dirt and displaced grass. Boot prints. Recent, made sometime in the last few hours while the ground was still soft from night dew. Size 11 or 12, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. The prints approached the house from the direction of Canyon Road, circled the building once, then stopped directly beneath Emma Miller's bedroom window. But it was what else Silas saw that made his blood run cold. Smaller prints, child-sized bare feet, walking not being dragged or carried, but walking of her own accord alongside the larger tracks. The trail led away from the house in a straight line toward the canyon country that began just past the edge of town. "Sheriff!" Silas called, his voice carrying a authority he'd thought he'd lost years ago. "Over here." Tom Hutchins was beside him in seconds, followed by Jake Miller and Doc Henley. The sheriff crouched beside the tracks, his face grim as he read the same story Silas had seen. "She went with him willingly," Jake whispered. "How is that possible?" "Emma's shy, afraid of strangers." "Not if the stranger wasn't a stranger to her," Silas said quietly. "These prints suggest she knew whoever took her, trusted them enough to go without struggle." The implications hit the gathered men like a physical blow. Emma Miller trusted someone who might have been watching the children of Dry Creek for weeks, gaining their confidence, preparing for this moment. "The break-ins," Doc Henley said suddenly. "Tom, what if they weren't random theft? What if someone's been studying the town, learning routines, figuring out which families have children?" Sheriff Hutchins's jaw tightened. "Could be. And if that's the case, Emma might not be the last." He turned to Silas. "These tracks, can you follow them?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. Silas stared down at the trail, leading toward the canyon country, feeling the weight of old skills and older responsibilities settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Beside him, the dog waited with patient intensity, amber eyes fixed on the direction the tracks led. "Yes," Silas said finally, "we can follow them. I'm coming with you." Jake Miller's voice carried desperate determination. "No." Silas's response was gentle but firm. "You're needed here, in case she comes back on her own. And if this is what I think it is, if someone's been planning this, then tracking's going to be slow, careful work. Too many people will just muddy the trail." "I can't just stand here. You can do the most important thing there is," Silas interrupted. "You can be here when we bring her home." The words carried a promise that Silas wasn't entirely sure he could keep, but they were what Jake Miller needed to hear. What they all needed to hear. Sheriff Hutchins nodded slowly. "How long will you need to get ready?" Silas looked down at the dog, who was now practically vibrating with eagerness to follow the trail. "We're ready now." As the first search parties began forming in the town square, Silas and his silent companion set out along the track that led toward Devil's Throat Canyon. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning mist, and time was already their enemy. But as they walked, something nagged at Silas's mind. The dog's behavior since discovering the trail had been intense but not surprised, almost as if the animal had been expecting this, as if he'd recognized something in the scent or the pattern of the tracks. 15 minutes outside town, the dog suddenly veered off the obvious trail, heading toward a cluster of rocks where water had collected in a natural depression. There, pressed into the mud beside what might have been a resting spot, was a small handprint, and beside it, something that made Silas's throat go dry. A piece of torn cloth caught on a thorny bush, blue gingham, the kind used for children's dresses. But it was what he found underneath the cloth that stopped him cold. A small wooden carving, crudely made but clearly representing a dog, the same size and general shape as his silent companion. The dog sniffed the carving once, then looked up at Silas, with eyes that held too much knowledge for any animal. In that moment, Silas understood that whatever was happening in Dry Creek, his quiet friend was more connected to it than anyone realized. The trail led on toward the canyon, but now Silas followed it with the growing certainty that they weren't just tracking a kidnapper. They were walking into a trap. The trail into Devil's Throat Canyon wound through increasingly treacherous terrain, where ancient waters had carved passages between towering stone walls that blocked out most of the sky. Silas moved with careful precision, reading signs in the disturbed earth, while the dog padded silently beside him, occasionally stopping to sniff at places where the scent seemed to pool and gather. They'd been tracking for 3 hours when Silas found the first deliberate marker, a small cairn of stones that had been recently stacked beside a boulder. It wasn't random. Someone wanted them to know they'd passed this way, wanted them to keep following. "This doesn't feel right," Silas murmured to his companion, studying the neat arrangement of rocks. The dog's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, but the animal's attention remained focused on the trail ahead. "Why make it easy for us to follow?" The answer came to him like a cold wind down his spine. "Because whoever had Emma Miller wanted to be followed." This wasn't a kidnapping in the traditional sense, it was a summoning. As if sensing his realization, the dog pressed closer to his leg, offering silent comfort. Silas reached down to scratch the animal's head, drawing strength from the contact. Whatever lay ahead, they'd face it together. The canyon walls grew higher as they penetrated deeper into the maze of stone passages that gave Devil's Throat its ominous reputation. Local legend claimed the canyon was cursed, that men who ventured too far into its depths were never seen again. Silas had always dismissed such tales as frontier superstition, but now, surrounded by oppressive walls of red rock that seemed to lean inward like grasping fingers, he felt the weight of accumulated dread that had given birth to those stories. A sound echoed from somewhere ahead, faint but unmistakably human. A child's voice, calling out in distress, "Emma!" The word escaped Silas's lips before he could stop it, and immediately he cursed his lack of discipline. Sound carried strangely in these narrow passages, and if someone was indeed waiting for them, he'd just announced their position. But the dog was already moving, drawn forward by instincts that seemed to go beyond normal canine behavior. Silas followed, his hand instinctively checking the position of the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He'd carried the weapon for 20 years, through his time as a lawman and tracker, but hadn't drawn it in anger since that terrible day 5 years ago, when a child's death had driven him into exile. The passage opened into a wider area where a natural spring fed a small pool. surrounded by relatively level ground. Here, the trail became confused, multiple sets of tracks leading in different directions, as if whoever they were following had spent time circling this area, perhaps making camp. But it was what the dog found that made Silas's blood run cold. Tucked behind a fallen boulder was a makeshift shelter constructed from branches and canvas, recent work, no more than a few days old. Inside, scattered across a blanket that had seen better days, were personal items that spoke of careful observation and planning. A child's hairbrush, blonde strands still caught in the bristles. A small pair of shoes that looked like they might fit a 7-year-old. And most disturbing of all, a collection of drawings executed in charcoal on pieces of bark, crude but recognizable sketches of the Miller house. Of Emma playing in the yard, of her bedroom window. "He's been watching her for weeks," Silas said aloud, his voice tight with controlled anger. The dog whined. Softly, the first sound Silas had ever heard him make, though it wasn't quite a vocalization so much as a barely audible exhalation of distress. Among the scattered items, Silas found something that made his hands shake: a tattered photograph of a man standing beside a wagon, a dog at his side. The dog in the picture bore a strong resemblance to his silent companion, though this one was clearly younger, healthier, and bore no signs of the trauma that had stolen his current friend's voice. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, "Marcus Kane and Rufus, 1868. The name meant nothing to Silas, but the dog's reaction was immediate and intense. His entire body went rigid, and for a moment his lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl, except no sound emerged from his damaged throat. "You know him, don't you?" Silas asked quietly. "This Marcus Kane, he's the one who hurt you." The dog's amber eyes met his, and in them Silas saw confirmation of a truth he was only beginning to understand. Whatever was happening in Devil's Throat Canyon wasn't random violence or simple kidnapping. It was personal. Someone from the dog's past had returned to finish something that had been started years ago. A child's cry echoed through the canyon again, closer this time and clearly coming from deeper in the maze of stone passages. But now Silas heard something else in that sound, not just fear, but a kind of forced quality, as if the child was being coached to call out at specific intervals. "He's using her as bait," Silas realized. "He knows we're following, knows we'll come for her. But why? What does he want with us?" The answer lay somewhere in the connection between Marcus Kane and the silent dog who'd become his closest companion. As they prepared to venture deeper into the canyon, following Emma's cries toward whatever trap awaited them, Silas found himself wishing the dog could speak, could tell him what had happened in the years before they'd found each other, could explain why a ghost from his past had chosen this moment to emerge from whatever shadows had hidden him. But perhaps silence was its own kind of communication. As they set out from the makeshift camp, following the increasingly obvious trail that led toward the heart of Devil's Throat, the dog stayed close to Silas's side, his presence steady and reassuring. Whatever Marcus Kane wanted, whatever drove him to steal children and lure former lawmen into canyon traps, they would face it together. The walls grew narrower as they climbed higher into the canyon system, and somewhere ahead, Emma Miller continued her coached cries for help. But Silas was no longer thinking like a rescuer charging toward salvation. He was thinking like a tracker who'd walked into someone else's game and beginning to understand that the only way out was through whatever waited at the end of this carefully laid trail. Behind them, the entrance to Devil's Throat seemed impossibly distant, already swallowed by shadows and the maze-like passages they'd navigated to get this far. Ahead, the unknown beckoned with the voice of a frightened child and the promise of answers that Silas wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The dog pressed against his leg once more, and Silas drew what comfort he could from that silent contact. In a world where voices could lie and words could deceive, there was something profoundly honest about the loyalty of a damaged creature who'd chosen to trust again. Whatever came next, they would meet it as they'd met everything else since that first desperate night in the mountains together, in silence, with the kind of understanding that ran deeper than speech. The cry came again, weaker now, and Silas felt urgency warring with caution as they climbed through a passage so narrow they had to move single file. The dog led the way, his silent paws finding purchase on stone that seemed to crumble at the slightest touch. Above them, the strip of sky, visible between the canyon walls, had darkened with approaching storm clouds, and the first distant rumble of thunder promised complications Silas didn't want to consider. Flash floods in these canyons could kill a man in minutes, turning dry passages into torrents of crushing water and debris. If Marcus Kane had planned this timing deliberately, then he knew the country well enough to use even the weather as a weapon. They emerged onto a ledge that offered a brief respite, and their first clear view of the canyon's interior structure. From this vantage point, Silas could see that Devil's Throat was even more complex than he'd imagined, a honeycomb of passages and chambers carved by eons of water and wind into the red sandstone. It would be easy to get lost in such a maze, easier still to disappear entirely if someone didn't want to be found. But it was what he discovered, tucked under an overhang of rock, that made his blood run cold. A child's dress, blue gingham, torn and stained, with what might have been blood. Beside it, a crude doll made from sticks and scraps of cloth, but this doll was different from a normal child's toy. Its arms had been bound with thin rope, and its face bore scratched marks that suggested violence. The dog sniffed the dress once, then backed away with his hackles raised. Whatever scent he'd found there, it meant something terrible to him. "Emma!" Silas called out, unable to maintain silence any longer. His voice echoed off the stone walls, distorting and multiplying until it seemed like a dozen men were shouting the child's name. No answer came back except the mocking echo of his own desperation. But something else reached him on the shifting wind that moved through the canyon passages, a sound that raised the hair on his neck and arms. Laughter, low, rough, and edged with a madness that spoke of minds broken by isolation and obsession. "You always were too easy to bait, lawman." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off canyon walls until its source was impossible to pinpoint. But the words themselves carried enough menace to make Silas's hand move instinctively to his holstered Colt. "Marcus Kane," the name tasted bitter on his tongue. "Where's the girl?" Another laugh, longer this time, trailing off into echoes that seemed to continue long after they should have faded. "Safe enough, for now. But we both know you ain't really here for her, are you? You're here because of him." There was a pause, heavy with implied meaning. "Because of what's mine that you took." Silas glanced down at the dog, who was now pressed against the canyon wall, his body language speaking of recognition and barely controlled terror. Whatever history existed between these two, it ran deep enough to leave scars that went beyond the physical damage to the animal's throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," Silas called back. "I found him half dead in the mountains. He was abandoned." "Abandoned?" The voice rose to a shriek that seemed to come from the stone itself. "He was stolen, taken by interfering bastards who didn't understand what they were destroying." The pieces began falling into place with the terrible inevitability of a landslide. The dog's damaged voice, his scars, his immediate trust in Doc Henley, but wariness around other strangers, all of it pointed to a past filled with deliberate cruelty. And now that past had caught up with them in the form of a madman who considered the gentle animal beside him to be property. "What do you want?" Silas asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "What's mine? What was always mine? Rufus belongs to me, and no amount of time or distance changes that." The voice had dropped to a conversational tone, somehow more frightening than the earlier screams. "The girl's just incentive to make sure you don't try anything foolish. Bring him to the heart chamber, and maybe she gets to go home to her mama. And if I don't?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any threat could have been. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and the first drops of rain began to spatter on the stone around them. In the distance, Silas could hear the sound that every canyon country veteran learned to fear, the growing roar of water rushing through narrow passages, carrying with it the debris of everything in its path. But the dog Rufus, apparently, had begun moving again, picking his way along the ledge toward a passage that led deeper into the canyon's heart. His movement was purposeful, as if he knew exactly where they needed to go, as if he'd been here before. Silas followed, his mind racing through possible strategies and finding none that didn't end with either Emma Miller dead or himself and the dog trapped in a flooding canyon. Marcus Kane had chosen his ground well, using the weather and geography to eliminate most options for escape or maneuver. The passage they entered showed signs of long occupation tool marks on the walls where someone had widened natural openings, carefully placed stones that formed steps in difficult areas, and most disturbing of all, deep scratches in the rock that looked like they'd been made by claws, or by a dog trying desperately to escape. "He was here," Silas said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn. This is where Kane kept him. The dog's reaction confirmed his suspicion. Rufus was moving faster now, but not toward whatever trap awaited them. He was moving with the terrible purpose of something returning to face its demons. As they climbed higher into the canyon's depths, following passages that grew more obviously artificial with each turn, Silas found himself wondering if rescue was even possible anymore. The roar of approaching floodwater was growing louder, the rain was increasing to a steady downpour, and somewhere ahead waited a madman with a child hostage and years of grievance to settle. But Rufus pressed on with grim determination, and Silas matched his pace. Whatever happened in the heart chamber that Marcus Kane had mentioned, they would face it as they'd faced everything else together, with the kind of loyalty that couldn't be broken by time or trauma or the promise of violence. The only question was whether either of them would live to see the sun again. The heart chamber opened before them like a cathedral of stone, its domed ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to swallow their flickering torchlight. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, spirals, and animal figures that spoke of peoples who'd found this place sacred long before Marcus Kane had corrupted it with his madness. But it was the scene in the center of the chamber that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. Emma Miller sat on a natural stone platform, her small figure dwarfed by the enormity of the space around her. She was alive, unharmed, as far as Silas could tell, but her eyes held the glassy stare of shock that he'd seen in too many victims over his years as a lawman. Beside her sat a man who might once have been handsome, but years of isolation had carved deep lines of paranoia and obsession into his features. Marcus Kane looked to be in his 50s, though the harsh lines around his eyes and the grey threading through his unkempt beard suggested hardship beyond his years. He wore clothes that had once been fine, a wool coat and leather boots that spoke of money and status, but everything about him now carried the taint of madness, barely held in check. "There's my old friend," Kane said, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. His eyes weren't on Silas but fixed entirely on Rufus, who had gone perfectly still at the sight of his former tormentor. "Been a long time, hasn't it, boy? 5 years of running, 5 years of trying to forget what you are." Rufus's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and Silas could feel the tension radiating from the dog's compact body. But beneath the anger, there was something else. A bone-deep terror that spoke of experiences no living thing should have to endure. "Let the girl go," Silas said, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his Colt. "Your quarrel's not with her. My quarrel's with anyone who takes what belongs to me." Kane's voice remained conversational, but his eyes never left Rufus. "Do you know what he was before you found him, lawman? Do you know what I made him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Emma Miller whimpered softly, and the sound seemed to galvanize something in Rufus. The dog took a careful step forward, placing himself between the child and his former captor. "I know enough," Silas said quietly, "I know you hurt him. I know you stole his voice and left him to die. That's all I need to know." Cain laughed, the sound bouncing off stone walls until it seemed to come from every direction at once. "Stole his voice? Is that what you think happened?" He leaned forward, his eyes glittering with manic intensity. "I gave him purpose. I gave him meaning. He was the perfect tool, intelligent, loyal, silent. He could slip into any camp, any house, any heart, and people would trust him enough to let their guard down." The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. "You used him to scout for raids, to gain people's trust before you robbed them." "Robbed them?" Cain's voice rose to a shriek. "I liberated their wealth, their children, their innocence. And Rufus was my key to everything until bleeding hearts like you decided he needed saving." Silas glanced down at the dog, seeing him now through the filter of this horrible revelation. The animal's immediate trust in Doc Henley, his gentle nature with children, his ability to read people's intentions, all of it made terrible sense when viewed as the remnants of training designed to exploit human kindness. But then he looked at Emma Miller, saw how Rufus had positioned himself protectively in front of her despite his obvious terror, and understood that whatever Marcus Cain had tried to make him, the dog had chosen a different path. "That's all in the past," Silas said firmly. "He's not your tool anymore, isn't he?" Cain reached into his coat and withdrew something that made Silas's blood run cold, a silver whistle, polished to mirror brightness. "Some training runs deeper than conscience, lawman. Some conditioning can't be broken by time or kindness." The whistle rose to Cain's lips, but before he could blow it, Rufus did something that surprised everyone in the chamber. Instead of cowering or freezing in remembered terror, the dog threw back his head and released a sound Silas had never heard from him before, not quite a howl, not quite a bark, but a raw expression of defiance that seemed to come from the depths of his damaged throat. The sound echoed through the chamber like a battle cry, and Emma Miller's shocked eyes focused for the first time since they'd entered. She looked at the dog, then at Silas, and something like hope flickered in her young face. Cain lowered the whistle, his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty. "Impossible. I made sure the conditioning was perfect. You made sure of nothing," Silas interrupted, understanding flooding through him. "You tried to break something that couldn't be broken, and when you failed, you threw him away like a piece of damaged equipment." The truth was there in Rufus's stance, in the way he held himself between his former tormentor and the innocent child who needed protection. Whatever conditioning Marcus Cain had attempted, it had been overwhelmed by something stronger, the simple choice to be good instead of evil, to protect instead of betray. Thunder crashed overhead, and the first trickle of water began to seep into the chamber from the passages above. The storm was intensifying, and soon the flash flood would reach them. But Cain seemed oblivious to the danger, his attention focused entirely on the dog, who'd refused to remain his creature. "You think you can just walk away from what you are?" Cain's voice carried a note of desperate fury. "You think 5 years changes anything? You're mine, Rufus. You'll always be mine." But Rufus had already given his answer. As water began to pool around their feet and the sound of rushing torrents grew louder in the passages beyond, the dog stood firm, no longer a victim, no longer a tool, but a guardian, with everything to protect and nothing left to lose. In that moment, Silas understood that the real confrontation was just beginning. The water was ankle-deep now and rising fast, carrying with it the detritus of the canyon's upper reaches, branches, stones, and the ominous sound of larger debris crashing through the passages above. The chamber that had seemed like a cathedral moments before was rapidly becoming a tomb, and Marcus Cain finally seemed to understand the danger his obsession had led them all into. "We have to get out of here," Silas said, his voice cutting through the growing roar of floodwater. "All of us. This place will be completely flooded in minutes." But Cain shook his head, his grip tightening on Emma Miller's shoulder. The child whimpered, and Rufus's low growl, the first sound of anger Silas had ever heard from him, filled the chamber with menace. "No one leaves until I get what I came for," Cain said, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who'd spent 5 years planning this moment. "Rufus comes with me, or we all die here together." It was then that Silas noticed something he'd missed in the initial shock of confrontation. Scattered around the stone platform, where Cain held Emma, were dozens of carved wooden animals. Dogs, mostly, but also horses, rabbits, even a few human figures. Each one was exquisitely detailed, despite being made with obviously crude tools, and many showed signs of having been handled repeatedly over years. "You made these," Silas said, understanding dawning. "All this time, you've been carving memories." Cain's laugh was bitter, edged with self-awareness that made it somehow more frightening than his earlier madness. 5 years of nothing but time and regret. 5 years of remembering what I lost when your kind decided to play savior. The wooden figures told a story, the progression of a man's descent into obsession. The earlier carvings showed skill and care, but the more recent ones grew increasingly frantic, desperate, as if Cain had been trying to carve his way back to a relationship that had never really existed. "He was never yours," Silas said quietly, watching as Rufus inched closer to the platform where Emma sat. "Whatever you did to him, whatever you forced him to become, that wasn't ownership. That was abuse. I saved him." Cain's voice rose to compete with the rushing water. "Found him as a puppy, starving in an alley in Denver. Gave him purpose, training, a place in the world. And he repaid me by running the first chance he got." The water was knee-deep now, and Emma Miller was crying, not the coached cries they'd heard earlier, but the genuine terror of a child who understood she might die in this stone prison. Rufus whined softly, a sound of distress that cut through the noise of the flood. "Listen to me," Silas said urgently, addressing Cain directly. "Whatever happened between you two, whatever you think you're owed, none of that matters. If we're all dead, help me get the girl to safety, and we can settle this somewhere that won't kill us all." For a moment, something almost rational flickered in Cain's eyes. The survival instinct warring with obsession, self-preservation, battling against the madness that had driven him to this desperate act. But then his gaze fell on the wooden carvings floating around them, 5 years of work dissolving in the rising flood, and his face hardened with renewed determination. "If I can't have him back, then no one can have him." Cain's hand moved to his belt, where the gleam of metal revealed a knife that had seen considerable use. "Some things are worth dying for, lawman. Some bonds can't be broken by death." It was then that Rufus did something that changed everything. Instead of backing away from the threat, instead of cowering or showing the fear that Cain clearly expected, the dog stepped fully onto the platform. He looked directly into his former tormentor's eyes and sat down, not in submission, but in the kind of calm defiance that spoke of a choice freely made. The message was clear. If Cain wanted to hurt Emma Miller, he'd have to go through Rufus first. "You don't understand," Cain whispered, his knife hand trembling. "I made you. Without me, you're nothing. Without me, you would have died in that alley." But Rufus's amber eyes held steady, and in them Silas saw something that took his breath away, not just courage, but forgiveness. The dog understood exactly what Cain had done to him, understood the years of manipulation and abuse, but he'd chosen to move beyond that understanding to something larger. The water reached the platform, and Emma Miller scrambled to her feet with a frightened cry. The chamber was filling faster now, and soon even the raised stone wouldn't offer protection from the flood. "Last chance," Silas called out, drawing his Colt but keeping it pointed at the ceiling. "Let me help you get out of here. Let me help all of us get out." Cain's gaze moved from Rufus to the rising water to Emma Miller's terrified face, and for a heartbeat, Silas thought reason might prevail. But then, the madman's eyes fixed on something behind Silas, one of his wooden carvings floating past, a perfect miniature of Rufus that must have taken weeks to complete. 5 years, Kane whispered, watching his obsession literally dissolving around him. 5 years of preparing for this moment, and now. He lunged forward with the knife, but not toward Emma or even toward Silas. His target was Rufus, the dog who'd refused to remain broken, who'd chosen loyalty over fear and protection over survival. But Rufus was ready. As the blade descended toward him, the dog didn't try to escape. Instead, he threw himself sideways, knocking Emma Miller off the platform and into Silas's waiting arms, even as Kane's knife found its mark. The chamber filled with the sound of rushing water and a man's scream of rage, and beneath it all, barely audible, the sound of a dog who'd finally found his voice again, using it not in pain, but in triumph. The flood was upon them, but Silas held Emma Miller tight and watched as Marcus Kane's obsession was finally washed away by forces larger than madness or revenge. The knife had missed Rufus entirely. As the chaos of the flooding chamber swirled around them, Silas realized that what he'd taken for a mortal strike had been something else entirely. Marcus, Kane stumbling as the rushing water knocked him off balance, his blade glancing harmlessly off the stone platform as Rufus completed his protective leap. But it was what happened next that changed everything Silas thought he understood about this confrontation. Emma Miller, safe in his arms, suddenly spoke in a voice too calm for a terrified 7-year-old. Uncle Marcus always was clumsy when he got excited. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He looked down at the child he'd been trying to rescue, seeing her clearly for the first time. The shock in her eyes when they'd first entered the chamber hadn't been fear, it had been surprise at being interrupted. "Emma?" His voice carried all the confusion and dawning horror he felt. The little girl's face shifted, losing the innocent vulnerability that had driven him through miles of dangerous canyon. In its place was something calculating and far older than her 7 years. "Not Emma," she said with a small smile that belonged on no child's face. "Though the real Emma is safe enough, probably still sleeping in her bed, dreaming about monsters that don't exist." The implications crashed over Silas like the floodwater rising around them. "Who are you?" "Mary Kane," the child replied, her voice carrying a pride that was chilling to hear from someone so young. "Marcus is my father, and Rufus." She looked at the dog with an expression of possessive affection that mirrored her father's madness. "Rufus was my best friend before the mean men took him away." Marcus Kane, struggling to maintain his footing as the water reached his chest, laughed with genuine joy for the first time since they'd entered the chamber. Clever girl. Always was, too smart for her own good. Silas felt the world tilting around him as he understood the depth of the deception. The break-ins, the watching. "You weren't planning to kidnap Emma Miller at all." "Of course not," Mary said, her child's voice made grotesque by the adult cunning behind it. "We needed you to come to us, needed you to bring Rufus where we could get him back. Emma Miller was just—" "What's the word, Papa?" "Misdirection," Kane supplied, his eyes bright with paternal pride. "The tracks leading away from her house, the torn dress, the cries in the canyon, all Mary's idea. She's been practicing Emma's voice for weeks." The truth was even worse than Silas had imagined. They hadn't rescued a child from danger, they'd been manipulated by one. Every decision he'd made, every step he'd taken into this trap, had been guided by the performance of a 7-year-old who'd learned manipulation from a master. "But how?" Silas began, then stopped as he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Around Mary Kane's neck, barely visible beneath her torn dress, hung a delicate silver chain, and at the end of that chain was a whistle identical to the one her father had pulled out earlier. "We've been calling him for weeks," Mary said, following his gaze with satisfaction. "Every night, just at the edge of hearing. Dogs remember their training, Mr. Grady. Even when they think they've forgotten, their bodies remember." Rufus whined softly, and Silas saw the truth in the animal's posture. The strange alertness he'd shown in town, the way he'd seemed to recognize scents and sounds that meant nothing to anyone else, he'd been responding to conditioning that ran deeper than conscious thought. That's why he's been different lately, Silas realized. More restless, more focused on the canyon. You've been calling him home. Not home, Marcus Kane corrected, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction despite their dangerous circumstances. Back to his purpose, back to what he was meant to be. The water was chest deep now, and even the platform where they'd been standing was beginning to submerge. But Mary Kane showed no fear, only the confidence of someone who'd planned for every contingency. Don't worry about the flood, Mr. Grady. Papa and I know these caves better than anyone. There's a passage just behind that wall. She pointed to what looked like solid stone. It leads up and out to the rim. We'll all be safe soon enough. And then what? Silas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then Rufus comes home where he belongs, Mary said simply. And you go back to your mountains and forget you ever found him. It's really very simple. But as she spoke, Rufus moved closer to Silas, pressing against his leg in the way that had become so familiar over their months together. The dog's loyalty hadn't been broken by weeks of subliminal conditioning. If anything, it seemed to have been strengthened by the test. Marcus Kane noticed the gesture, and his face darkened. That's not how this was supposed to work. The whistle training should have made him come running back to you like nothing had changed. Silas interrupted, understanding flooding through him. You spent 5 years assuming that the relationship you forced on him was real, but you never understood what you actually had. We had everything, Mary said, her child's voice cracking with emotion for the first time. We were a family, a real family, and then strangers came and stole him away from us. The pain in her voice was real, and Silas felt a stab of sympathy for this damaged child who'd known no other life than manipulation and conditional love. But sympathy couldn't change the truth of what she and her father had done or what they were still planning to do. Families don't own each other, he said gently. They choose each other, every day, freely. Pretty words, Marcus Kane snarled, struggling toward the hidden passage his daughter had revealed. But words won't change the fact that Rufus is coming with us. As if summoned by his name, the dog looked up at Silas with those amber eyes that had seen too much suffering and too much kindness. In that gaze was a question that needed no words to be understood. The water was rising toward their necks, and decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether any of them lived to see another sunrise. But first, Silas had to trust that the bond they'd built was stronger than the conditioning Marcus Kane had tried to forge in pain and fear. The choice, as it had always been, belonged to Rufus. The water reached Silas's shoulders, and Mary Kane's confidence finally showed its first crack as she realized that even her father's knowledge of the caves might not be enough to save them. The hidden passage she'd mentioned was still several feet above the rising flood, and the current was growing stronger by the minute. "Papa," she said, her voice smaller now, more like the child she actually was, beneath all the manipulation and learned cruelty. "Papa, we need to go now." Marcus Kane was struggling toward the wall she'd indicated, his movements hampered by the rushing water and the weight of his soaked clothing, but his eyes never left Rufus, even as death approached them all. "He comes with us," Kane gasped, fighting against the current. "I didn't plan this for 5 years just to..." "To what?" Silas interrupted, his own voice strained as he fought to keep his footing in the churning water. "To die in here because you can't let go of something that was never really yours." Rufus whined softly, the sound carrying clearly despite the roar of the flood. The dog was swimming now, but staying close to Silas, his choice made clear by his actions. Whatever conditioning the Kanes had tried to re-establish, it hadn't been enough to overcome the bond built through months of genuine care and mutual healing. "You don't understand," Mary said, and for the first time Silas heard real desperation in her voice. "He's all we have left. After Mama died, after we lost everything, Rufus was the only good thing we had. The only thing that made us feel like a real family." The admission hung in the water-filled air like a confession. and Silas felt his anger toward the child begin to shift into something more complex. She was a victim too, shaped by loss and her father's madness into something that barely remembered how to be human. But understanding didn't change the immediate reality. The water was still rising, and they were rapidly running out of time. "There," Marcus Kane called out, his hand finding purchase on a ledge that marked the entrance to the hidden passage. "Mary, swim to me, now." The child hesitated, her eyes moving between her father and Rufus, with an expression of genuine anguish. "But what about—" "The dog will follow," Kane said with desperate certainty. "He has to follow. It's what he was trained to do." But Rufus remained beside Silas, paddling steadily but showing no sign of moving toward his former captors. The months of freedom had taught him the difference between conditioning and choice, and he'd made his decision clear. Silas watched Mary Kane struggle against the current, her small body barely able to make progress toward the passage entrance. Despite everything she'd done, despite the elaborate deception that had nearly cost them all their lives, she was still a 7-year-old child in mortal danger. The decision came without conscious thought. Silas pushed through the water toward her, catching her small body just as the current threatened to sweep her away from the passage entirely. "I've got you," he said, lifting her toward the ledge where her father waited. "Grab my hands, Mary. Trust me." The irony wasn't lost on him, asking for trust from someone who'd spent weeks deceiving him. But desperation had a way of cutting through all pretense, and Mary Kane's small hands gripped his with the fierce strength of someone who wanted very much to live. "Thank you," she whispered as he boosted her up to the passage entrance. "Thank you, but why?" "Because you're a child," Silas said, simply, "and children deserve a chance to choose who they want to become." Marcus Kane helped pull his daughter into the safety of the passage, his face a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "The dog," he said, reaching down toward the water. "Help me get the dog." "He's not yours to take," Silas replied, treading water beside the passage entrance. "If he wants to come with you, that's his choice. But I won't force him." The water was at the passage entrance now, and soon even this escape route would be underwater. But Rufus remained in the chamber, swimming in steady circles around the area where Silas struggled to stay afloat. "Please," Mary called down from the passage. "Rufus, please come home with us. I promise we'll be different. I promise we'll be better." The dog's amber eyes looked up at her, and for a moment, something like recognition, even affection, flickered in their depths. Whatever else the Kanes had done, they had loved him in their way. But love without respect, love that demanded ownership rather than offering freedom, wasn't love at all. Rufus made his choice by swimming to Silas and pressing against him in the water, offering what comfort he could as they faced the flood together. "I'm sorry," Silas called up to the passage, where Mary Kane's small face was streaked with tears. "I'm truly sorry it has to be this way." Marcus Kane's expression hardened back into the madness that had driven him to this point. "Then you'll both die down there. And maybe that's what you deserve, stealing what doesn't belong to you." "Papa." "No," Mary whispered. "They saved me. We can't just—" "We can and we will," Kane snarled. "If I can't have him back, then no one will." The flood surged higher, and Silas realized with growing clarity that they might not have a choice anymore. The passage entrance was almost underwater, and even if he wanted to change his mind about Rufus, the physical reality of the situation was rapidly removing all options. But then he noticed something he'd missed in the chaos of rising water. Another passage, smaller and partially concealed, on the opposite side of the chamber. It was barely visible above the floodline, and getting to it would mean fighting against the current, with no guarantee that it led anywhere safe. "There," he said to Rufus, pointing toward their slim hope of escape. "That's our way out, boy. You ready for one more adventure together?" Rufus's response was to position himself next to Silas in the water, ready to follow wherever their partnership led them. Even if it led to death, they would face it as they'd faced everything else together. The sound of Marcus Kane's rage echoed from the passage above as father and daughter retreated to safety, leaving behind the dog who'd chosen freedom over captivity and the man who'd offered him that choice. But Silas barely heard the curses and threats. His attention was focused entirely on the swim ahead, on the narrow opening that represented their only hope, and on the silent companion who'd already proven that some bonds were stronger than fear, stronger than conditioning, stronger even than death itself. The water reached the chamber's ceiling, and their desperate swim toward salvation began. The passage was a nightmare of stone and rushing water, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders and filled with debris carried down from the upper reaches of the canyon system. Silas swam with desperate efficiency, one hand gripping an outcropping of rock to pull himself forward, the other maintaining contact with Rufus as they fought against the current that seemed determined to drag them back into the flooded chamber. Behind them, the roar of collapsing stone announced that the heart chamber was finally succumbing to the flood's power. Whatever ancient forces had carved that cathedral space from living rock, they were no match for the fury of water seeking its level. The sound drove Silas forward with a renewed urgency. There would be no going back, even if they wanted to. Rufus struggled beside him, his smaller body working twice as hard to make progress against the torrent. But the dog's determination never wavered, his amber eyes fixed on the distant promise of light that flickered somewhere ahead in the passage. The water tasted of mud and metal, carrying with it the debris of the entire canyon system, branches, stones, and things Silas didn't want to identify. His lungs burned with the effort of stealing breaths between waves, and his arms screamed with the strain of fighting the current. But Rufus's presence beside him, the warm press of fur against his shoulder, gave him strength beyond his physical limitations. 30 yards into the passage, disaster struck. A surge of water more powerful than any they'd yet encountered caught them both, slamming Silas against the passage wall with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. For a terrifying moment he lost his grip on the rock, felt himself being dragged backward by the relentless current. Rufus's teeth closed on his sleeve gently, carefully, but with enough determination to arrest his backward slide. The dog had somehow found purchase against the passage floor, his claws digging into cracks in the stone, and was using his own body as an anchor to keep them both from being swept away. In that moment, as he struggled to regain his grip on the slippery rock, Silas understood something profound about the relationship they'd built. It wasn't just that he'd saved Rufus from death in the mountains, they'd been saving each other all along, each offering the other something essential that had been missing from their lives. "Good boy," he gasped, finding new handholds and pulling them both forward again. "Good boy, Rufus. We're going to make it." The passage began to angle upward, and the light ahead grew stronger. But with each yard of progress, the water became more turbulent, as if they were approaching some kind of bottleneck where the flood was being forced through an increasingly narrow space. The sound that reached them was unmistakable, the thunder of water pouring over a drop-off somewhere ahead. They were approaching a waterfall, which meant either salvation or destruction, depending on what lay below it. "Hold on," Silas called to Rufus, though he knew the dog couldn't hear him over the roar of rushing water. "Whatever happens next, hold on to me." The passage opened suddenly into a vertical shaft where water cascaded down from somewhere high above. The flood that had nearly killed them in the chamber was now pouring out through this natural chimney, carrying them upward in a dizzying spiral of stone and spray. Silas grabbed for handholds on the shaft walls, trying to control their ascent, but the force of the water was too great. They were being carried upward, whether they wanted to be or not, riding the surge like leaves in a hurricane. The world became a spin, blur of stone and water, and desperate struggle. Rufus pressed against him, no longer trying to swim, but simply holding on, as they were lifted by forces beyond any human ability to control. Up and up they rose, through a shaft that seemed to penetrate to the very heart of the mountain. And then, suddenly, They burst through into open air and sunlight. The flood expelled them onto a rocky ledge, perhaps 50 feet above the canyon floor, where they lay gasping and shaking in the afternoon sun. Below them, the water continued to pour out of the mountain's depths, but they were safe, battered, exhausted, but miraculously alive. Silas rolled onto his back, feeling solid rock beneath him for the first time in what seemed like hours. Beside him, Rufus shook himself with determined dignity, as if nearly drowning in a flooded cave system was just another minor inconvenience in their shared adventure. "We made it," Silas whispered, hardly daring to believe it was true. "We actually made." But even as relief flooded through him, he knew their ordeal wasn't over. They were alive, but they were also stranded on a narrow ledge high above the canyon floor, with no obvious way down and storm clouds gathering overhead for what promised to be another deluge. And somewhere in the maze of passages below, Marcus and Mary Kane had escaped through their own route, carrying with them the knowledge of what had happened and the burning resentment of a plan that had failed. The immediate crisis was over, but Silas understood that the larger confrontation, the one that would determine whether he and Rufus could ever truly be free of the past, was still to come. They had been on the ledge for perhaps an hour, slowly regaining their strength, when the sound of voices drifted up from the canyon below. Silas peered carefully over the edge and felt his heart sink at what he saw. Marcus and Mary Kane stood at the base of the cliff, apparently having emerged from their escape passage unharmed. But they weren't alone. With them were 3 other men, rough-looking characters, with the bearing of hired guns, or worse. The reinforcements Marcus had apparently arranged as backup for his elaborate plan. "They're up there," Mary's voice carried clearly in the canyon's acoustic bowl. "I can see them moving around." Marcus Kane raised his voice to shout up at the ledge. "Come down, lawman. There's nowhere else for you to go, and we have all the time in the world." Silas studied their situation with growing grimness. The ledge they were on was perhaps 10 feet wide and 20 feet long, enough space to move around, but offering no real escape route. The cliff face above was too steep to climb without proper equipment, and the drop below was certainly fatal. But it was what one of the hired men was carrying that made the situation truly desperate. A rifle with a telescopic sight, already being assembled with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to use it. "We could wait," Marcus called up. "Sooner or later you'll have to come down for water or food. Or we could just make it easy on everyone and settle this now." Rufus pressed against Silas's leg, and when he looked down at the dog, he saw something unexpected in those amber eyes. Not fear or resignation, but a kind of calm determination that spoke of decisions already made. "What is it, boy?" Silas asked quietly. "What are you thinking?" In response, Rufus moved to the very edge of the ledge and released a sound that Silas had never heard from him before, a bark, clear and strong and defiant. It echoed off the canyon walls like a challenge thrown down to everything that had tried to break him. The effect on Marcus Kane was immediate and electric. "Rufus," he called back, his voice cracking with desperate joy. "There's my good boy. Come on down, and we'll forget all about this unpleasantness." But the dog's response was to bark again, louder this time, with a note of unmistakable rejection that needed no translation. "He's telling them no," Silas realized with wonder. "He's found his voice, and he's using it to tell them no." Mary Kane's small voice rose from below, thick with tears. "Please, Rufus, please come home. We love you." And perhaps they did, in their damaged way. But love that demanded ownership, love that tried to control and manipulate, wasn't the kind of love that could build trust or create genuine bonds. Rufus barked a third time, and this sound was different again, not defiant or rejecting, but somehow final. A goodbye that carried both sorrow and resolution. Then he did something that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. The dog moved to a specific spot on the ledge where loose stones had accumulated and began digging with purposeful intensity. "What are you?" Silas began, then stopped as he understood. Rufus was creating a rock slide. The dog's claws worked at the loose stone with desperate efficiency, and Silas quickly joined him, using his hands to dislodge the larger rocks that the flood had deposited on their precarious refuge. Below them, Marcus Kane's voice rose in alarm as he realized what they were planning. "Stop! You'll bring the whole cliff down! You'll kill us all!" But Rufus didn't stop. If anything, he worked faster, as if he understood that this was their only chance, not just to escape, but to end the cycle of pursuit and obsession that had poisoned so many lives. The first large stone broke free and plummeted toward the canyon floor, forcing the men below to scramble for cover. Then another and another, as the accumulated debris of countless storms began its inevitable journey back to the earth. Marcus Kane's voice rose to a shriek of pure anguish. "Rufus, no, don't do this, don't leave me." But the dog had already made his choice. As the rock slide gained momentum and the hired gunmen fled for safer ground, Rufus looked up at Silas with eyes that held perfect peace. In that moment, man and dog understood each other completely. They had both been broken by the past, both scarred by choices they couldn't change. But they had also both learned that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, and that freedom was worth any price. The rock slide roared down into Devil's Throat Canyon, carrying with it the last remnants of Marcus Kane's obsession and the final echoes of a voice that had chosen love over fear. Above it all, Rufus barked one more time, clear and strong and free. 3 months later, Silas Grady walked down Main Street in Dry Creek with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. Beside him, Rufus padded along with the easy grace of a dog who'd finally learned that the world could be trusted most of the time with the right companion. The town had changed in subtle ways since their return from Devil's Throat Canyon. There was less tension in the air, fewer suspicious glances cast at shadows that might hide watching eyes. Sheriff Hutchins had organized a proper search of the canyon system once the floodwaters receded, but they'd found no trace of Marcus Kane or his hired men. The rock slide had sealed off several passages, and if the obsessed man had survived, he'd apparently taken his daughter and disappeared into the vast wilderness beyond. More importantly, the real Emma Miller remained safely in her bed, where she'd been sleeping peacefully throughout the entire ordeal. The break-ins had stopped, the sense of being watched had lifted, and Dry Creek had returned to the quiet rhythms that made it a good place to raise children and grow old in peace. "Morning, Silas." "Morning, Rufus." Margaret Murphy emerged from her store with a genuine smile, her flour-dusted hands already reaching for the treats she'd taken to keeping specifically for the dog who'd become something of a town hero. "How are our brave adventurers doing today?" Rufus accepted the offering with polite dignity, his tail wagging in the relaxed way that had replaced the cautious tension of his earlier days. Since finding his voice in the canyon, he'd become more expressive in every way, not just the occasional bark when something deserved comment, but a whole range of body language that spoke of a creature finally comfortable in his own skin. "We're doing well, Mrs. Murphy. Just picking up supplies before we head back up to the cabin." "You know," she said thoughtfully, "folks have been talking about how you handled that business in the canyon, about how you came back to help when the town needed it." Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I didn't do anything special, just followed a trail where it led." "Maybe so, but the point is, you followed it, even when it led somewhere dangerous." Margaret's expression grew serious. "There's been talk about offering you Tom Hutchins's job when he retires next spring, official-like, with a badge and everything." The suggestion hung in the morning air between them, and Silas found himself considering it with less automatic rejection than he might have months earlier. The mountains had been good to him, had given him the solitude he'd needed to heal from old wounds. But perhaps healing wasn't meant to be permanent, exile from human connection. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "Appreciate the confidence folks are showing." As they made their way toward Doc Henley's office for Rufus's regular checkup, Silas reflected on how much had changed since that first day when he'd ridden into town with a silent, damaged dog. The animal walking beside him now bore little resemblance to that broken creature, just as Silas himself felt little connection to the haunted man who'd fled into the wilderness 5 years earlier. Doc Henley's examination was thorough but brief. Rufus's physical healing was complete, and his mental recovery had progressed to the point where the old veterinarian pronounced him as close to normal as any of us get. "Remarkable transformation," the doctor said, scratching Rufus behind the ears with practiced affection. "When you first brought him in, I wasn't sure his spirit would ever heal properly. Trauma like that, it leaves scars that go deeper than the physical. He's stronger than anyone gave him credit for," Silas replied. "Just needed time and the right circumstances to remember who he really was." "Could say the same about you," Doc Henley observed, with the frankness of someone who'd lived long enough to speak truth without apology. "Town's better for having you both back in it, even part-time." As they prepared to leave town and return to their mountain cabin, Silas found himself pausing at the mouth of Canyon Road. The memory of their desperate journey through Devil's Throat would always be with him, but it no longer carried the weight of unfinished business. Whatever demons Marcus Kane had brought back from the past, they'd been laid to rest in the flood waters and rock slides that had sealed those passages forever. Rufus looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom earned through suffering and redemption. The dog's voice had returned, but he used it sparingly, a bark of greeting for friends, a warning when strangers approached with unclear intentions, and occasionally, on quiet evenings, when the mountain wind carried the scent of distant storms, a low howl that spoke of remembrance and resilience. "Ready to go home, boy?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. Rufus's tail wagged once, and they set out together toward the high country where peace lived, in the sound of wind through pine trees and the company of someone who understood that the deepest bonds were forged not in possession or control, but in the daily choice to trust and be trusted in return. Behind them, Dry Creek settled into another peaceful day, secure in the knowledge that some broken things could indeed be mended, and that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to accept it when it was offered. The mountains called them home, and together man and dog, tracker and companion, two souls who'd found in each other exactly what they'd needed most. They answered that call with hearts, finally free from the shadows of the past. In the years that followed, stories would be told in Dry Creek about the mountain man and his remarkable dog who'd faced down madness in Devil's Throat Canyon and emerged victorious. But those stories, true as they were, would miss the deeper truth that Silas and Rufus carried with them into the high country. Some victories weren't won with guns or courage or clever strategies. Some victories were won simply by choosing, day after day, to believe that love was stronger than fear, that trust was more powerful than control, and that the bonds between kindred spirits could weather any storm the world chose to send their way. And in the end, that belief had been enough to set them both free.